Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I'll be your host. We are at the beginning of a forced energy transition, a global system change based on an energy transition away from hydrocarbons and a so-called net zero revolution. Climate change is being offered as the rationale. Technically, all countries are supposed to embrace the net zero transition and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG scores. But so far, only the Western developed countries and their corporations are following, including Canada. But what about China and the rest of the world? The recent meeting in Glasgow of COP26, the global climate meeting, ended with a watered-down pledge from the world's largest carbon consumers and emitters. China and India stated that they would not phase out coal, but rather phase it down at some point in the distant future. It is clear then, despite environmental groups' pronouncements to the contrary, China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, is not giving up its use of hydrocarbons anytime soon. Indeed, there's a fair amount of deception, dishonesty, and lack of candor surrounding the net zero transition and the true goal of China's global ambitions. For example, while the West commits to keeping their hydrocarbons in the ground, China is expanding their use. While Western countries pursue unreliable renewables, China will make and export the solar panels and windmills to us. While Western private petroleum companies are denied financing due to ESG requirements and climate risk financial disclosures, Chinese state petroleum companies are not bound by such rules and buy up assets around the world. By forcing an energy transition away from reliable hydrocarbons and pursuing net zero, countries in the West become weaker in every way. China did not begin the environmental movement, but it's certainly taking advantage of the self-destructive situation and is encouraging the voluntary decline of Western civilization. As Sun Tzu said, and I quote, "The greatest victory is that which requires no battle," end quote. China will have no need to wage a hot war with the West for global dominance if the West destroys itself first. China has been quite clear that its ambition is to be the dominant global superpower by 2050. Which just so happens to coincide with the climate change net zero targets. In either scenario, net zero or Chinese domination by 2050, both end in some form of authoritarianism. The costs of net zero to our civilization and humanity are too high, and the benefits of hydrocarbons to human flourishing need to be considered. China is certainly considering it. Our current system may not be perfect, but it has improved the care of our environment and planet and people unlike any others. This is a system worth restoring and fighting for. Joining me today to discuss China's global ambitions, how it's related to the climate movement, and the push for a net zero transition, is economist and executive director of Probe International, Patricia Adams. Ms. Adams has written several books on foreign aid, environmental policies in the developing world, and is an authority on China's environmental policy. Her most recent publications are two very insightful reports, China's Energy Dream and The Red and the Green, China's Useful Idiots.
Hi, Tammy. That sounded terrific.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's such a pleasure to speak with you.
It's my pleasure.
I'm wondering if you could give the listeners some background on how you came to write these reports and why understanding China's role in climate change policies and the net zero transition is important.
Well, many reasons. China's energy policy has been very troubled in the past. Our particular interest has been in its hydro dam building, which is, I think, uneconomic, does extraordinary environmental harm, and has grown enormously over the last 30 years. I predicted years ago in conversations with my Chinese colleagues that the dominance of the climate change issue that was growing in North America at the time, this was in the 1990s, was going to come to China, and they should be on alert for it. Now, climate change is irrelevant to people in China. It means nothing. What they care about is smog. They care about air quality. And it has all kinds of implications for their use of fossil fuels. But the issue of climate change is irrelevant. And over the years, what happened was that indeed, as I predicted, especially the U.S. environmental movement moved into China. Most other environmental groups were forced to leave China because of Chinese Communist Party rules on NGO participation with other NGOs and think tanks in China. Now, of course, the only NGOs that can operate inside China are those that are approved by the Communist Party and are overseen by different government departments, and their plans are approved by the national police. So they are very much under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. Anybody who is doing independent research inside China and in collaboration with think tanks inside China from abroad is pretty much been pushed out. And what remains are the environmental organizations from the West who work pretty much in tandem with the Chinese government to push the argument that climate change is a global threat and that everybody should curtail their use of fossil fuels. But of course, the Chinese Communist Party has no intention of doing that.
That's really interesting that you make that link between what they were trying to secure more energy through the hydro dams, which of course environmentalists seem to be rather have a contradictory position on it. On the one hand, they want renewables and they sort of count hydro as part of it. In fact, the environmentalists in Canada often proclaim how great Canada is because we have so much hydropower. But on the other hand, they have such dramatic environmental impacts that tend to be ignored in certain circumstances when it's convenient, I suppose. And it's interesting that you saw that as something important in China that could lead to something more curtailing their development.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I take my hat off to the Chinese environmentalists and think tanks. They were right on this issue from the get-go. They knew that the climate change issue was entirely irrelevant in Canada, at least in China. There was a very interesting podcast. It was sort of like a TED Talk that was done by a Chinese journalist in probably 2018, 2019, called Under the Dome. And I think it is probably still available on the internet. It was an expose of why the country was under such a cloud of smog. And it was an expose into corruption, poor regulations, lack of enforcement, and so on. Never once was climate change mentioned in this podcast. Meanwhile, yes, I think you're right. I think Western environmentalists who were concerned about hydro dams were caught. The U.S. foundations in particular, but also from Europe, have supported only those organizations who will adopt a climate change policy of concern about climate change and getting rid of fossil fuels. And the groups that were concerned about hydro dams found themselves in a very difficult position because, of course, one of the alternatives to fossil fuels is electricity from hydro dams. Hydro dams are very destructive. Their destructive qualities are well known. They're not based on models. They're well measured. There's a lot of evidence around the world. There's no debate while information continues to be collected. And one of the interesting things about China, and this sort of gets to their geostrategic interest in assuming a dominant position in the world by 2049, which is the centenary of the takeover of China by the Communist Party, is to control the rivers that are coming out of Tibet. So they take over Tibet, and there are this is the location of the headwaters of 10 rivers flowing through 10 downstream countries. China has been building dams like there's no tomorrow on all of these rivers just before they reach the border. And it has put China in a position now where they can control water flows for 2 billion people. And all of the countries that are downstream know very well that China has their boot on their neck. And of course, this is one of the things that China wants to do, wants to dominate. And it wants to get countries, neighbors, trading partners, and so on in a dependent relationship with China so that they can get their way. And the environmental groups who were concerned about hydro dams have been not entirely silent, But in many cases, they said, oh, well, hydro dams are bad because they emit CO2. Hydro dams are bad for all kinds of reasons, and the evidence is very readily available. Doesn't mean that every hydro dam is bad, but they do create a lot of harm, and you need to know what that harm is going to be before you build them. You need to factor it into the cost-benefit calculations, and that rarely happens. So yes, you're right. I mean, the environmentalists, they went AWOL on the hydro dam issue, and I think they were caught because they knew full well that their funding would end if they didn't adopt an anti-fossil fuel position.
Right, absolutely. It's interesting that you say that about the destructive powers of the hydro dams, and it reminds me of how the environmental groups have they're still pushing for keeping hydrocarbons in the ground, but there's this second track now about biodiversity and that we have to change land use and all these other things in order to protect biodiversity. So once again, the contradiction, hydro dams destroy various elements of biodiversity, which the environmentalists are now rather quiet on, especially with respect to what you've just described, the reason for taking Tibet and controlling the 10 rivers. That's outrageous. And nobody knows about it. I think that's what's so, we're not really paying attention to the larger activities of China. We seem to only be concerned about these little things that happen in our own backyard or might have some sort of little bit of effect on us. But that's huge.
It is huge. And if you just Google the Mekong, you'll see all kinds of pictures of the Mekong drying up. Now, there are a lot of people who depend on the Mekong for their livelihoods, for their protein. That's where they get their fish, agriculture, and so on. And what has happened now is that because China has these dams on the upstream of these rivers, including the Mekong, they control water flows. So in some cases, they'll have unannounced releases, which have led to deaths in downstream populations. And in other cases, they will withhold water without informing people downstream, which is also extremely destructive. But yes, I mean, this is very typical of China's, the Chinese Communist Party's behavior. They use whatever tool they can find to keep other countries in a weak position and put them into a weak position so that they can force these countries to do various things.
But this brings me, because you mentioned geopolitics, and I cited the Sun Tzu maxim in my introduction because I found that an excellent part in your article, how you have this whole one section in your report, China's Energy Dream, titled War Without Fighting. And you use that Sun Tzu maxim as sort of the frame for these different ways that China is basically using the West against itself in order to weaken us, in order to pursue this larger ambition of world domination by 2049. And you're not alone in making this assessment. Michael Pillsbury wrote an excellent book, The 100-Year Marathon. There's been quite a few books recently and other reports coming out describing that, we should take this seriously when the Communist Party of China wants to say, we want to have Chinese domination by 2049 for the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. We should take them seriously. So why do you think Western leaders don't take them seriously on this?
Well, I think 30 years ago, when China entered the WTO, there was great hope. And I think we were naive, but there was great hope that they were going to reform, that they were going to go from a dictatorship to being a democracy, that they would adopt the rule of law, that living standards would improve. Many of the people we worked with said this, and they hoped that as the middle class accumulated assets, that they would start demanding political rights. It hasn't worked out that way. And the Communist Party, I think it is worth looking at them in this light. And that this was a concept that was introduced to us by one of our board members, Jane Jacobs, many years ago, when she said, you can sort of divide countries into raiders and traders. And in Western democracies, we are traders. We establish the rule of law. We have rules. we follow them, people break them, there are negotiations, there are resolutions, but generally everybody accepts that the rule of law is a mechanism that raises all boats in the tide. I mean, we are all better off with these rules that encourage competition and innovation and protection of property rights and so on. And in that, I would include environmental ecosystems as property rights. So we accept that. But China, the Chinese Communist Party does not. They are raiders. And so what they do is they cheat, they lie, they steal, they kidnap. They don't follow rules. They don't abide by treaties that they sign. They are after power. And what they have done for 30 years, and I think that we've only just started to realize this, is that they've used our rules against us. They've used our institutions against us. And it takes a while to realize this. Now, we've seen since the Paris Agreement, 2015, year after year after year, China continues to expand its use of fossil fuels. And I don't disagree with that. I think their policy is actually quite sensible. But for the environmentalists who want to get China to reduce fossil fuels, and us as well, they need to wake up and see that China has no intention of reducing its fossil fuels. Why not? The Chinese Communist Party is first and foremost concerned about staying in power. And they know that if they do not continue to secure fossil fuels, either domestically or from foreign sources, and increasingly they're dependent on foreign sources, that they won't be able to keep people employed. And if they can't keep people employed, they're in trouble. The other thing is that in order to accomplish this hegemony that they are after, this dominance, this global dominance, they need fossil fuels. The development, the growth, the survival of the Communist Party depends on fossil fuels. And I think the environmentalists who continue to lobby the Chinese government and to act as if someday China is going to live up to its promises, whether it's 2030 or 2060, is a fiction. They've got to wake up. And I think when you place this in the context of China's geostrategic goal, which is to dominate the world and to get countries to follow its rules, and it's very busy changing the rules in institutions like the UN, different UN agencies, in Interpol. It is changing the rules before our very eyes. Look at what happened to Hong Kong. It did not abide by its treaty with Britain. And in a year or two, it has completely transformed what was once a freedom city. It is no longer. We have to wake up and look at what they're doing and realize that central to all of this is securing fossil fuels. They absolutely must get them. They are expected to be dependent for 80% of their oil by 2030. At the moment, about 41% of their gas comes from foreigners. Their domestic supplies are either dwindling or they're hard to get at. They do have large supplies of gas, but it's shale gas, and the geology is different than it is in the United States, and they're having a great deal of difficulty getting it out because they're unable to innovate. And they're unable also to give the incentives to the private sector to encourage them to get it out. And just about every Western oil and gas company has gone into China to try to get this shale out of the ground, and they can't. So what's missing here is what we would call the soft institutions of democracy, rule of law, incentives, property rights, and so on. They're not there. And it's an enormous handicap for China, but it's essential for the Communist Party in order for them to stay in power to be able to control all of the variables. And they do so at great cost to China, and they do so at, of course, enormous cost to the people of China.
That's a really good summary that you've that you've given about that. I think one of the key points there is that fossil fuels equals global dominance. And I would say that in agreement, as long as fossil fuels remain the dominant form of energy that we use for everything, because it's the most reliable. So far, it's the most efficient. It's you can move it around and it's much better than anything else that we have so far developed. That's not to say, of course, that something else couldn't be developed in the future, but we are not there yet, not even close. And I find it difficult to understand why Western governments, and Canada in particular, that is now, drank the net zero Kool-Aid, talking about phasing out our fossil fuel production within the next 18 months, or at least embarking upon that. And understanding, how could they not understand that it will mean our demise? I mean, the engineering realities behind renewables are just so clear. Why can't they see it? And I find it interesting how China is able to sort of capitalize on that willful blindness in order to assert their dominance. And I wonder what you've just said about China and whatnot. How does that affect Canada, and why is that important for Canada?
Well, what you say is absolutely true. That it is willful blindness on the part of Canada to think that we are going to become a renewable energy country. And I think as we're seeing it happen in Britain right now, for example, with the plans to go net zero are starting to bite back. It looks like Boris Johnson may lose his job. The Conservatives may lose government, because the practical implications of the fantasy of net zero is that your oil and gas prices go up. And despite all the rhetoric and all the propaganda over the last 30 years that we should be going green and abandoning fossil fuels and using green power, we are not. And the reason we're not is because they don't work. Renewable energy systems are very unstable. They always have to be backed up by thermal power. And that's true in China as well. They build very flamboyant solar panel farms in the shape of pandas and so on, but they can't meet the energy needs of the Chinese Communist Party. And they will not meet the energy needs of Canadians. And I think that once energy prices start going up, once supply constraints start to hit, that's when the public will say, enough. We've got to get rid of this government. We've got to have a different plan. And we've got to go back to what works. I think it's very, very interesting to see that the contribution of green power, and by that I mean wind and solar globally, is still 3%. It's been there for decades. It's 3%. It's okay in some applications. It might be helpful in some applications, but it is not going to provide a stable source of electricity that is needed for a modern industrial economy. Now, having said that, there are environmental consequences to any energy source. And that includes wind and solar too. There's the materials that go into it, the mining that's necessary, the disposal of the systems when they stop working, and so on. And there are consequences from the burning of fossil fuels. What I think the West has done very well and China has not, because they do not have the rule of law and they don't have democracy, is that we have managed to get down what I would call the killer components and the killer emissions that come out of the burning of fossil fuels. So the NOx and the SOx and the particulates. While we've continued to use fossil fuels and our CO2 emissions have tracked the growth in GDP, the growth in what I call the killer emissions have actually gone down a lot. And the reason for that is because the public says to our politicians, we're not going to breathe that. That is hurting us. That is killing us. We won't breathe it. And if you continue to allow it, we're going to vote you out of office. The people in China can't say that. They can't do that. And that's why they live under this dreadful blanket of smog. And it kills 500,000 people in that country every single year because they can't sue the companies. They can't sue the government. They can't throw their government out of power. That's why they live with smog. So whatever energy source we choose, you have to have transparency, you have to have accountability, you have to have a good cost benefit analysis. You need to know what the environmental consequences are of all of this. And I think in Canada, what's happened, and in many Western countries, is that's just gone by the wayside. Nobody's, people are living in a dream world, thinking that somehow windmills and solar panels are going to replace fossil fuels. And I think if you look at a country like China, they know what's going on. And they also know, for example, that they're not going to run their aircraft carriers with windmills and solar panels. They are on the move. They're very aggressive. And they're trying to secure more and more foreign sources of oil and gas because they have so little of it in China. And that's one of the reasons behind their military expansion, behind the Belt and Road Initiative, which is building ports and railways and pipelines around the world in order to secure fossil fuels and also to secure marine transportation routes for them to get their oil and gas delivered to China. At the moment, their marine transportation routes depend on 3 choke points, which are controlled by other countries, and that makes the Chinese Communist Party very, very nervous indeed. Which is one of the reasons that they're using the Belt and Road Initiative to build what's called the String of Pearls, which is a series of ports and naval bases in compliant countries. And of course, they get these countries to be compliant either by threatening to cut off their rivers, as they're able to do now, because they're controlling the 10 rivers coming out of Tibet, or by giving them money, by basically paying them off and giving them lots of cash. I think if you take a country like Canada, we have a lobby here that is in favor of continuing the old relations with China. I think many of them want to make investments in China and take advantage of cheap labor. And indeed, what they're taking advantage of is not only cheap labor, but very low environmental standards. And they're the ones who are arguing for business as usual in China. They are way behind the public. I think the Canadian public has understood very clearly, and I think the great big light bulb went on over the arrest of the 2 Michaels. I think when that happened, following on the arrest of Meng Wanzhou on the extradition request from the United States, and then picking up these 2 innocent men and holding them hostage, I think was a moment of great clarity for Canadians. We realized instantly what this government in China was all about, and the Canadian government is way behind.
Absolutely, and I just hope that the Canadian public doesn't forget. There was a parliamentary committee that was established to investigate the various things going on in China, and it just was disbanded a few weeks ago to nary a protest. So, but I mean, at this point, sorry, go ahead.
Well, what's very interesting about that committee, it was a special committee on Canada-China relations. They did terrific work. They were gathering wonderful evidence. It was disbanded, I believe, because the election was called, and then the Conservatives decided not to argue to restore it. And that is now being protested, I believe, by 5 Conservative members of Parliament who are saying, no, we really do need to restore this committee. It was doing terrific work. And I hope they succeed. It was doing terrific work. They were producing an awful lot of very, very good evidence.
I hope so as well. I think it's really important to have at least some sort of watchdog or whatever on what our relationship is with China and the various goings on in between. The other thing that I thought was interesting was this recent purchase of the Neolithium company, a Canadian mining company with set to exploit the largest lithium deposit in Argentina, was bought by the Zin Corporation out of China. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, Zin Mining. And the Canadian government didn't enact a security review of it. And the conservatives, for whatever reason, dropped the ball and only started speaking out against it this week, and demanding a security review. So on the one hand, we've got these the environmentalists and their supporters in our federal government who suggest that we can go renewable. We've got lots of these minerals to make the solar panels and windmills available in Canada. We need to mine them. We have Canadian companies mining all over the world, and we can somehow get a benefit and be less reliant on overseas sources and capitalize on this transition. But on the other hand, China controls most of the production of those rare earth minerals. They control most of the production of lithium in the world. They control 85% of the world's magnesium production, which is crucial for making the solar panels. So they would make them, they would mine the minerals, and then they would sell them back to us. And somehow this is supposed to be great for our economy and energy security. It's absurd. And I think what's so frustrating is that there's all of these strings of absurdities, and the rational people point out this is absurd. You can't do this. The reality is something else. And it's like a drop in the bucket and it's not heard. And I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions on how to try and get the federal government in their various policy moves they're doing now to listen to these realities?
It's a really good question. I think that you're right, that you call it absurd. I think a lot of people are just scratching their heads, wondering, what is the federal government doing? China has made it very clear that they are an aggressor. They do not follow rules. Calling for the ban on canola and Canadian pork. It was clearly a bullying tactic. This is not what countries who trade do. This is a raiding nation, and the Canadian government needs to understand that. The Canadian public understands it. It's a puzzle to me. I agree with you about the sale of that lithium company. Very clearly, what we need to do is to disengage from China. We need to reduce our dependence to the extent that we are dependent. And actually, I think Canada is relatively independent of China compared to other countries like Australia. And Australia has been much bolder than we have in calling China out on COVID, for example, and other things. And China punishes them in the same way that they tried to punish Canada. So there's a lot we could do, but we've got to reduce whatever dependence we have on them. We've got to find alternative markets, alternative suppliers. I think we should start by recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. We should recognize Tibet as an independent country. It was promised the same thing that Hong Kong was promised 50 years ago, back in the 1950s. And slowly but surely, the Chinese government just ignored it. The Communist Party ignored their commitments and their obligations. They do not keep their word. So we should recognize Tibet. I think we could also get the CPPIB, which is the investment arm of the Canadian Pension Plan, to start winding down its investments in China. They have approximately 12% of their investments now are in Chinese investments. They plan to go to 20. They should stop that immediately. They should get rid of that plan, and they should start disinvesting. I think, for example, Chinese spies. Have lots of them in China and lots of them in Canada. I think the recent loss of several of the Conservative members of Parliament of their seats in the last election could well have been because of interference by Chinese spies. We need an investigation into that. And if they're in the country, they need to be deported. We need to get tough. We should remove ourselves immediately from the Asian Investment Bank that was set up by China, the Infrastructure Bank. China very much would like to be a member of the Arctic Council, even though it is not an Arctic country. It is doing everything it can to influence the activities of it. It is well known that they consider the Arctic to be a military militarily strategic route. We should not allow them to participate in the Arctic Council. We should ban Huawei. What on earth is the Canadian government thinking? This is a perfect way for the Chinese Communist Party to be able to hack into our systems, to bring down electricity systems, to compromise all sorts of infrastructure in the country. And the Canadian government's had ample warning about this. It is utterly baffling why they would not announce a banning of Huawei, and so on. We should set up a registry for agents of foreign governments. We should introduce the Magnitsky rules, seize the assets of the individuals who are Chinese individuals who are human rights offenders. They don't like that. They hated it when the U.S. government did it. And that's what we need to do. We need to start getting tough on China. But the most important thing, I think, is to disengage and to make sure that we are not dependent on China for anything. And all countries, I think, are now getting serious about finding alternative sources of the rare earths and the various minerals that you mentioned. And this is long overdue.
One of the things I was thinking is that in Europe, I understand this desire for finding alternatives to oil and gas because they don't really have any. And it's like on the continent, and what they do have, they've chosen not to develop. So, and they become dependent on Russia for their natural gas and their oil and the various international trading, through the Mediterranean and tankers and all that. But so I understand why they would want to pursue something like renewables, windmills and solar panels, which originally were constructed in Germany. So of course, Germany had a great, they thought they were going to boost their economy from doing this. And of course, then all that production ended up going offshore to China. Mm-hmm. But Canada, it makes no sense to ban fossil fuels and pursue a course of renewables, which will only serve, I believe, to make us more dependent on China.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And this is, I think, it gets to another wonderful insight by General Sun Tzu, the great military strategist, who said that you should use and the weapons that are given to you by the enemy, and they will give them to you. And really, the climate change policies are exactly that. They are weapons for the enemy. The Chinese government is using them against us and against the United States and against Western Europe. And it is truly remarkable that our governments could be so willfully blind, so naive, as to go along with it. We need clarity. We need grown-ups in government to recognize what is going on.
Absolutely, because this is very much a national security issue. And Canada doesn't seem to see it as a national security issue. They somehow believe, at least the activists who are informing the government and serving in certain positions in government, that national security isn't even on the radar, that somehow they make this facile argument that renewables will somehow make us more secure from the ups and downs of the international oil and gas market, when in fact all it does is make us more vulnerable. And for my family who live in Saskatchewan, it would be unbearable in winter. I don't know how you would survive with full renewables in the wintertime in minus 40. It just doesn't work. But it goes to it's so funny when I read President Xi's speeches, and he's always talking about it's a win-win and everything's a win-win, trying to put that happy spin on everything. But he's really saying what a win-win-win it is for China, because the West is weakened. It becomes dependent on minerals and components and whatnot that China controls. China corners the market on the reliable energy, which is a great win for them. China replaces the West as funders of development in developing countries, so they get political support or dominance. And like you said, all these other countries become dependent on China. So yeah, this is great for China. And we're handing them this weapon and saying, yes, you know what, we'll voluntarily emasculate our military. We will voluntarily destroy our economies and be then reliant and dependent on China. It's no wonder, when he goes to the World Economic Forum, I read his speech from Monday, and it was all about how it's a win for China.
Yes, I spend a lot of time reading China Daily, People's Daily, Xinhua, which are all, of course, propaganda arms of the Chinese government. So you get used to the propaganda, and you get to be able to read between the lines as well. And of course, President Xi is he's a master at it, and he's really sort of giving talking points, I think, to those governments who want to maintain good relations with him. Keep in mind that a lot of companies from the West want to go into China to set up manufacturing operations. Now that's changing a little bit because I think Western companies are coming to realize that it's dangerous for their staff to work there because they may be picked up the way the two Michaels were picked up. It's also very hard to operate in a country without the rule of law. And there was a wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago, indeed, about a wind manufacturer from the U.S. who set up operations in China and was just abused left, right, and center. I mean, I think he eventually left, but it's not easy leaving. I follow legal blogs that operate in China, give advice to foreign investors who are going into China, and they are full of cautionary notes that if you get into a dispute, you're in trouble. And it's easy to get into a dispute because your partner may be somebody high up in the Communist Party, and there is no rule of law. The Communist Party is setting it as they go along to fit the circumstances that they, and the outcomes that they want. So I think lots of Western companies want to get into China to set up operations. Slowly but surely, I think they're realizing that it's risky, it's dangerous. They may be forced to hand over their technology. It may just be outright stolen from them. Their patents may be stolen, and so on. But they still, I think, are holding out this hope that they can get into the country. It's a huge market. It's not as untapped as it used to be. I mean, of course, 20 years ago, it was people were really, really hungry in China for consumer goods and so on, and you could understand that. But I think it's the scale of that market which gives the Communist Party leverage over Western investors and Western governments, because our governments are under a lot of pressure from companies who want to have good relations. They either want to trade with China or they want to set up investment opportunities there. So I think they've got our governments are getting pressure from both sides, and I think luckily now there's more and more information about the ill intentions of the Chinese government and its utter failure to follow the rules. I think one of the interesting things that's going on right now in China is what I would call President Xi's war on the private sector. And he is coming down hard, as you probably know, on the tech sector. Jack Ma, the head of Alibaba, was disappeared for a time. And It was because he had given a speech in which he was critical of the Chinese regulators. And then Ant, one of his companies that wanted to have an IPO in the U.S., had difficulty, and they have been curtailed as well. One of the reasons for President Xi's crackdown on the tech companies is that they control information. They have detailed information on Chinese citizens, their spending patterns, their wishes, and so on, and they're seen as a threat by President Xi. So he's not approaching this as a capitalist or as a leader of a free country that understands that the private sector has a very, very, very important role, a crucial role in an economy, in innovating and investing and so on. And so it I think is an indication to the attitude that the Communist Party has towards the private sector. You think you're a big company, you think you've got sway, you think you've got influence, and you don't. Look what happened to Jack Ma.
That brings me to an interesting point about ideology, because I was reading, I think it was an article by Michael Rechtenwald, and he was making the argument that the net zero transition and its corresponding sort of reset of the global system is a form of capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And he was explaining the way he meant it was that capitalism was merging with a Chinese-style political system of increased state intervention in the economy and authoritarian measures to control the population. And in explaining this, he talked a bit about how when the communist system was established, they decided that because it was an agrarian system and there wasn't an industry there, they sort of had to do socialism or communism in reverse. So they kind of needed to build up some means of production in order to solidify the sort of communist things that they wanted to do later. And so they were willing to kind of bring up a sort of middle class there, using capitalist influx of money and the companies that set up business in China and whatnot in order to develop that class. But eventually, down the road, 2049, it will all be state. And he's not sure that they'll actually be able to achieve the full communist system that is the dream of Marx and Lenin and so on and Mao, but in his thinking they're kind of on that road, and he sees the sort of crackdown on the private tech companies and the sort of tightening of the screws against private investment and whatnot as leading in that direction. And I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition that we have that capitalism in our Western system is becoming more Chinese, authoritarian, and especially what we've seen with the lockdowns and what's been taking place in Western economies since the outbreak of the virus.
Yes, indeed. It's a very interesting way to put it. That he has. I think that the Chinese Communist Party is very conflicted. On the one hand, they want progress. They want to raise the standard of living of the citizens. That's how they stay in power. Often it is done through state-owned enterprises. In some cases, companies that have more of an arm's length relationship from the government. Alibaba would be a good example. Years ago, there was a case of a company, a private company, a coal company that was very successful in the area of Xi'an, which is a big coal mining area. And it got to be so successful that the government shut it down, or they basically took it over. And the reason was that it represented a power source. So they cannot stand independence. They can't stand private sector parties that are successful and big and are smart. And so they shut them down, or they take them over, or they swallow them up into their state-owned enterprises. And I think what you're saying about the Western countries is sort of the managerial state, and where the government takes over more and more of the decisions that really ought to be made by the private sector because they have more knowledge about their business. They know how to innovate. They know how to save money. They know how to be more efficient. They know how to compete. But for political reasons, governments get more and more involved through regulatory regimes and so on. And that does grind down the private sector. It becomes harder to do business unless, of course, your market is the government. And if your market is not necessarily individuals, but the government, well, then that's who you're serving. And that's not good for our economies. That's not going to going to lead to the kinds of advances and innovations that happened in Western countries when there was more respect for property rights and less intervention by governments. Governments, think they know how to run companies. They don't. The state-owned enterprises are notoriously inefficient, and of course, China is the best example of that. I mean, their state-owned enterprises and their national champions are behemoths. They're slow, they're inefficient, they're debt-ridden, and the government keeps them afloat because it's important for political reasons to keep them going and to providing some of the services, even though they're providing them very inefficiently.
So, what do you think then of this growing interconnection between Russia and China? I was reading Daniel Yergin's book, The New Map, and he outlines in a bit of a broad brush the growing interdependencies between Russia and China. And he makes the case that it's asymmetrical, that China doesn't necessarily need Russia, but Russia needs China. And I kind of disagree. I think they both need each other as a secure supply of oil and gas and backing up on the international stage as a strategic partner. But what do you make of it?
I think it's a fragile relationship. I think that Russians are much closer to us in their values than they are to the Chinese, and certainly to the Chinese Communist Party. They have had lots of disagreements over the decades. I think they're suspicious of each other. I know in the negotiations over the power of Siberia 2, there were hard feelings and a lot of hard negotiating over who would pay, and it was not a happy relationship. There are a great deal of tensions between Russia and China, and I think we should be careful not to push Russia into a position where they feel they've got to ally themselves with China, because China is very, very clearly hostile. That's not to say that we don't have disagreements with Russia as well, but I'm not so worried about the long-term relationship there because I think it's not a natural one. I don't think they like each other. I don't think they have a good history, and they don't trust each other.
That's interesting, especially given, like you had mentioned earlier, China's ambitions in the Arctic, because I'm pretty sure Russia believes the Arctic is their domain, and they certainly don't want China sticking its nose in there. However, it seems like they're willing to take Chinese money to help develop the various sort of Arctic Ocean transportation routes,
yes,
maybe help fund icebreakers and the Vostok development up in the north.
Yes.
And willing to cooperate in that respect. But yeah, it's interesting how China is trying to gain the sort of status to be part of the Arctic Council, and I wonder if Russia's behind them not being in it.
Yes, what I've read is that Russia's not at all happy with China being in it, and would like to keep them at bay. I don't know why the various members just don't say you are not an Arctic nation. You're not in it. They signed on to the Antarctic Treaty and then proceeded to violate it. So yeah, they are not good players. They do this, what's called salami slicing or gray zone expansionism, where they will move into an area like the South China Sea and establish a presence really before anybody realizes that they've done it. And once they have established that presence, it becomes very high stakes to challenge it. And most countries don't want to go to war. So they sort of establish these facts on the ground. When people need to stand up, countries need to stand up to them at the beginning of these really salami slicing and gray zone expansion tactics that they use, and say no. You have no right to turn these atolls in the South China Sea into military bases. we need to wake up and start resisting China. And I think the U.S. has really done a very good job at that. They were the first ones, I think, to start calling China out on the violations of treaties and laws and so on. And the rest of us have sort of followed suit.
Do you think that strong U.S. sort of resistance can continue under the Biden administration?
It's a good question. They have been good in some respects. I think they're under a lot of pressure right now to start relaxing on sort of exchanges of academics and so on. And of course, the Bidens themselves are compromised in their past relations with China. So it's very hard to have trust that they're able to represent the American people, well and honestly, because there are some skeletons there. But I would say they have done not a bad job so far, but they could probably do more, and we certainly could do more. I mean, the Canadian government really needs to start investigating inappropriate behavior by Chinese influencers, perhaps spies, maybe diplomats. We need to get serious about making sure that, for example, our election, or that citizens of Chinese descent who live in Canada or from Hong Kong are not being intimidated by the Chinese Communist Party. We have to get very serious about protecting Canadian interests and not Chinese interests.
One of the interesting things that I read a few months ago is that in certain restaurants in Vancouver, they have the cameras set up so that the Chinese nationals who are visiting Canada can have their social credit score added to or be monitored when they go to these restaurants. And I wonder, are you concerned at all that the Chinese social credit system and its similarities with the sort of ESG scores or whatnot is coming to Canada and the West?
Well, I think it has come in many ways, with, as you mentioned, with ESG, but also I think with COVID. I think the vaccine passports, I think suddenly people are now getting used to the idea of identifying themselves before they go into a restaurant, for example. These are very serious violations of privacy. And the tragedy, I think, is that our privacy and information commissioners at the provincial level and the federal level have appear to have gone missing in action. I mean, these are important institutions to protect the privacy of Canadians, and we need them to be out there defending citizens. So I think this sort of creeping use of identification from your cell phone is very disturbing indeed. And I think it would be very easy for it to morph into a social credit system if you want to start monitoring, for example, how much gas you're putting in your car and therefore how much CO2 you're emitting. I mean, it's very easy to take these systems once they're established and start adapting them to all kinds of behavior. We should be on alert, and we should stop it.
Back in November, when Glasgow was going on, Polly Toynbee wrote an article in The Guardian talking about how the time has come for personal carbon trading and carbon allowances. And she made this, the case that this is, we are accepting vaccine passports. Why shouldn't we do this too? And I think you're right. The aspects of privacy that most Western societies used to take for granted we've just kind of said, oh no, that's okay. We don't need to do this anymore. And the privacy people, like you said, are missing in action on this. And from what I understand is when BC originally introduced its vaccine passport, they said, it's okay. It'll only be temporary. Therefore, we're within our rights to do this. But I have yet to see any provincial government give an expiry date on these things. So I don't think I agree with you. I don't think it's much of a stretch to start rolling in. You've got this fancy app on your phone. Why not add in all of these other things that nudge your behavior or can help refine your lifestyle choices? There was an article in CTV News yesterday on their website talking about how we have to make lifestyle changes in order to meet our climate change obligations. And of course, what they're listing is no meat or meat as a treat, and trying to say that we can't have a car, that we need to be walking and biking, that we shouldn't be living in a single family home. We should be living in a smaller apartment. And the article goes on, basically listing off the wet dream of the activists that have been in various academic articles over the past 5 or 6 years, and just trying to roll this out to the public that, why not? Why shouldn't we be doing more as individuals to stop climate change?
You mentioned the privacy and information commissioners. We've both been discussing that for the last few minutes. There's one former information and privacy commissioner who has not been silent, and that's Dr. Anne Cavoukian from Ontario. And she is no longer the privacy and information commissioner, but she has been speaking out about it. And she says that privacy is the basis of freedom and democracy. Without it, you can't have democracy. And she makes the same point that you just made, that once these systems are established, they never go away. And she's calling for investigations, as she calls it, look under the hood at the fine print, at the details of these various apps and laws that are being brought in. And she's alone. Where are the privacy and information commissioners who are actually in place right now? They're silent. And this is very similar to, I think, the collapse of a lot of the institutions that have made Canada a wonderful country to live in. We've got to defend the civil rights and the privacy of Canadians. And somebody in Ottawa may decide that CO2 is a problem. That's debatable. They may think that, but that is debatable. And to then take that assumption and say we're going to restrict the meat that you consume, or your purchase of a car, or your purchase of oil or gas is an infringement, and we need to stop it. It is just going too far.
Absolutely. I think of Stephen Guilbeault's statement to the Narwhal last week, I think it was, where he said, the government will mandate what cars there will be. And I thought, what gives you the right to tell a private company what cars you can make? And it reminded me of the Soviet Union, where there was the Trabant or the Lada. That was the mandated vehicle. And what bothered me was the lack of reaction to such a statement. Mm-hmm. And then to see in the Financial Post from the Canadian Business Association or whatever, where they were talking about how we need an industrial policy, and it's that the government needs to be taking more control over directing the economy. No. Look what it's done so far. I mean, this doesn't work. And this has been attempted in so many other countries, all that have been abysmal failures. Why do you think it will be any better now?
Exactly. And a very good example of this was given years ago. I don't know if you remember when there was the Volkswagen scandal. They were cheating on their emissions readings in order to meet U.S. emissions standards. And it came out in the press coverage at the time that what had gone on was the EU had decided that they wanted to change the car fleet in the European Union from a petroleum-based one to diesel, from oil to diesel. And I gather in the automotive industry, there's a lot of cooperation and maybe compulsion between governments and the car companies. And so the car companies started producing more and more diesel vehicles. So the fleet of diesel went up dramatically. The problem, and the reason for this was to reduce CO2. So if you run a car on diesel, you produce less CO2. So it was all defined and designed to reduce CO2 for climate change reasons. The problem is when you run a car on diesel, they don't have the mechanisms for extracting the NOx, the nitrous oxide. So what happened was there was more NOx being put out as the cars were switched from oil to diesel. And so I remember noticing articles about restrictions on driving in downtown Paris and in London and Rome and so on, because NOx levels were very high. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, this was the problem in LA back in the 60s. Why is this problem emerging now in Europe? And indeed, it was the result of a government decision to reduce CO2 emissions, to change the fleet of cars from running on oil to diesel, and that led to pollution in the cities. Well, this is the wisdom of governments in attempting to deal with CO2, which I would argue is a non-problem. It's a disaster, and really, you need to let the public convey their feelings about the environment to companies and to governments through courts of law and through the ballot box. And government should just get out of it and get out of the way, because they're making a mess of it.
I would push back a little bit on the courts of law aspect, because the environmental groups with a lot of money from various foundations that was revealed in the Allen Inquiry Report, the investigation that the government of Alberta did into the foreign funding of environmental groups, they have an enormous budget for litigation. And I agree that rule of law is great. And if you have the laws, then, companies should follow them. And Canada is one of the most overly regulated with respect to the environment in the world. And the environmental groups treat it like we're some Wild West where companies can do whatever they want. But the problem with litigation is then it ties up companies, sucks out resources that could be used for actually producing things that Canadians need and want. And in the end, shut down the companies that provide us with the things that we need and want. So I am a little reluctant to embrace the idea of litigation in these things.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And I think some people would argue that the issue here is that the culture has changed, and the courts may side with this sense that CO2 is a major problem. Well, based on what? And also, is that their job to voice opinions about scientific matter when they should be dealing with the law? But I completely agree with you that litigation and legal procedures are not always going to work and are not necessarily the way to go. Elections are a good way to go, however. And I think that it will come to that. I think as prices of energy go up, as is happening in England, if it becomes more and more expensive to heat your home in the winter and to run your automobiles and so on, I think people will start to push back. I hope. I think this is not going to happen overnight, and people need to challenge the climate change agenda and arguments. I think they have been challenged. I think that the science in favor of climate change is so very, very weak. It's astounding that it's gotten as far as it has.
I think part of that is the media representation of it. So there's there's no discussion that, oh, there's a consensus. And that's all people hear. And when I talk to, family and friends back in Canada and where do you get your news from? Oh, I get it from the Apple news feed on my phone, or, oh, it comes up on my iPad, or, oh, I listen to the news at night. And it's like, but what are they representing? They're representing that there's a catastrophe every day. There's some kind of weather event every day, and that it's always unusual and it's extreme and we have to do something. And there's just an endless stream of propaganda. Mm-hmm. And I hate to say that because we're supposed to be an open society with a fifth estate that is supposed to be neutral. And, I don't think it's ever been neutral. I think there's been times when the media has at least tried to be somewhat neutral a long, long time ago. But there's such a bias. And when the federal government funds the media, all of the media, pretty much, then I think there's a certain sense of obligation to report what the government wants the media to report. So I find, I agree with you 100% that whatever science they trot out to support climate change policies is extremely weak. Anyone who tries to publish in opposition to it either isn't published, they're retired, they have to do it independently. It's extremely difficult. And young scholars coming up know that where their bread is buttered. And it's really sad that our society has been diminished in this way. And I think that's why people are more accepting of things like a vaccine passport and will be accepting to some extent of personal carbon trading and whatnot, because there won't be anyone to say in a public space where lots of people will hear it that this isn't right, that it's not the way to go.
Yes, I agree completely with you about the press being sympathetic to the government because they get money from the government, and he who pays the piper plays the tune. And I think also the press has failed in the sense that they have accepted the hyper partisanship and the name calling. In the climate change issue and debate, what we have found over the years is that those pushing climate change refuse to debate us. Well, why? They will resort to name calling. It's bullying, is what it is. But it's also juvenile. They're not prepared to defend their positions, and I think that speaks volumes about their positions, which I think are very, very weak. I should just add something about carbon trading. Carbon trading emerged about 10 years ago, especially in Europe. It was prone to corruption, and to the point where Interpol and various sort of security intelligence agencies were issuing reports warning people about all of the different scams that were taking place in carbon trading, because you're basically trading something that you can't hold, you can't see, that nobody really wants. All you want is basically the piece of paper that says you saved carbon. And Interpol, for example, calls that an intangible. And when you have intangible products like that, it becomes very, very prone to corruption and fraud. So I don't hold any hope for these carbon trading apps that the government's proposing to put on cell phones. I think it'll be a great opportunity for criminals.
I think that that's a possibility for criminals to abuse the system and whatnot. But I know that the EU has been putting forward this idea of a digital ID. And one of the proposals is that every person will be assigned a unique identifier, a digital identifier that will be verified through blockchain or whatever new thing they want to jump on the bandwagon of. But you won't be able to do anything unless you put your digital ID in. So tied to that will be your health record, will be your vax passport, will be your carbon allowance. And so by using the ESG and climate risk disclosure metrics, that they're going to create this profile of everything and what the emissions are for everything and what's a sink and whatnot, so that a person's behavior certain activities will have a certain carbon allowance attached to it. And it'll be directly linked to each individual's digital ID. Part of the thing that the EU is proposing is that you won't be able to log on to the internet unless you put in your digital ID. So then everywhere you go on the internet will be linked back to your digital ID. So then the government will have access to all the different places you go, the different websites you see, how long you stay on a page. And last year, Ursula von der Leyen was explaining how one of the pillars of the Green Deal is digitization and this new digital revolution, and how they'll be able to harness all that information, and basically the government thinks they can make money off of it and also be able to have better control over people's behaviors. So on the one hand, I'm hopeful that it turns out, as you say, that it'll be open to corruption and be a house of cards and collapse. But on the other hand, I see that they're building this network, this framework of data that they hope to be able to link to individuals and thereby govern individual behavior, which is what concerns me about the climate, the TCFD things and the GFANs that was agreed at COP26, and that they're actively working towards this. And Canada has, I think, until the end of the month, opened up discussions on how these climate risk financial disclosures will be done in Canada. So there's 6 different reviews that the federal government initiated in December, just before Christmas, all of which come with an expiry this month, of what the policies for net zero should be going forward. And it's concerning. They claim they want this public input, but the only people who seem to know about it are the activists.
Yeah, that's very concerning. What you just described. This is exactly when we need our privacy commissioners to be standing up for us.
It's like we've forgotten what it means to be a free and democratic society. What exactly does that mean? And I'm concerned that, they throw words around like democracy or whatever without really understanding what it entails and what builds it and what maintains it. So I'm hopeful that conversations like this one can maybe reach some people to get them to think about this and consider what our trajectory is. And do we want to be more like China? Do we want to have China be the number one global dominant power in 2049? And will we then just be a province of of China's world?
Well, I can assure you that we don't want to be like China. I've worked with media, lawyers, environmentalists from China for 30 years, and it is a frightening, dangerous place. And we most certainly do not want to be like that. They study Western history, Western laws, Western regulatory regimes as models for how to make a transition to constitutional democracies and to rule of law in China. It would be a tragedy for us to go in the direction that you described. And I think ultimately the only thing that's going to stop it is if the public knows about it, understands the implications, and sends a very clear message to our governments. You're out of office if you do this. We won't accept this. But we have to get the information out to people.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights. I highly recommend your two recent reports. And I know you had an article in the Financial Post, I think it was in December, where you sort of summarize your reports into a much smaller space. I'll include links on the podcast webpage. So thank you very much, Patricia, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, Tammy. It was my pleasure.